The Impossible Alibi, a Hercule Poirot Mystery. Welcome. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Hercule Poirot Mystery. I'm Sam, your host, and I'm delighted to have you join me for another captivating tale of subtle clues, clever deductions, and human secrets. Before we embark, tell where are you from listening tonight? Share it in the comments. It's always wonderful to learn more about our curious and thoughtful community. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more mysteries. Chapter 1. Arrival at Ashford Manor. The evening mist clung to the winding driveway as Poirot's carriage approached Ashford Manor, soft wheels rolling over the damp gravel with a muted rhythm. The sprawling estate loomed ahead, its stone walls glowing warmly against the encroaching twilight, windows flickering with candlelight that promised both comfort and the faint whisper of secrets. From the carriage window, he noted the ivy climbing the facade, the distant outline of the stables, and the way the tall oaks swayed silently, their branches brushing the mist like hesitant fingers. The scent of wet earth mingled with the faint aroma of burning wood from the manor's hearth, a subtle reminder that beneath the grandeur lay life, habit, and human anticipation. Upon entering, the hush of quiet activity greeted him. Servants moved with careful precision, carrying trays of refreshments and adjusting curtains so that light fell just so across the richly carpeted hall. A distant laugh, polite and slightly strained, echoed from the drawing room where the guests had gathered, their figures half hidden by the amber glow of lamps. Poirot stepped inside with the ease of a man accustomed to observing, his polished shoes whispering across the stone floor as his gaze swept the room with unhurried scrutiny. A frown flickered almost imperceptibly as he noticed a gentleman perched at the edge of a settee, hands restless, fingers tapping a silent rhythm on his knee. Poirot's eyes, sharp and deliberate, drifted across the assembly. Lady Pembroke conversed quietly with a neighbour, her posture flawless, yet a tremor in her fingers betrayed unease. Across the room, a silver locket lay half-concealed in the palm of another guest, its chain curling loosely around slender fingers that refused to relax. Each gesture, each careful movement, Poirot catalogued mentally. Even the shifting of a chair, the soft clearing of a throat, became part of the intricate tapestry of observation he wove silently, as if the room itself whispered hints of a story waiting to be untangled. He paused near the hearth, pretending to admire the intricate carvings of the mantelpiece. Flames danced and crackled, throwing a gentle warmth over the guests, but Poirot's attention never wavered. The gentleman with twitching hands shifted again, eyes darting toward the window as though expecting an unseen visitor. A subtle detail, the catch of a breath, the fleeting tightening of lips, did not escape Poirot. The locket gleamed faintly in the lamplight, and he made a quiet note of the way it rested against the hand, almost protective, almost secretive. The gentle clinking of a tea tray punctuated the quiet tension. Servants moving with soft efficiency, yet there was a rhythm to the room beyond the ordinary. A slight dissonance hidden in polite smiles. Poirot's mind catalogued each face, each interaction, noting patterns that would reveal themselves later. A lingering glance, a careful avoidance of direct eye contact, the faint tremor of nerves beneath composed manners. Every detail was a whisper of story, and he listened attentively, as one might hear the first lines of a delicate symphony. A soft gust of wind rattled a distant window, and the room seemed to shift imperceptibly, the polite calm now tinged with undercurrents of suspicion. Poirot adjusted his posture, settling comfortably in the armchair nearest the fire. The evening had begun. Introductions were proceeding, yet beneath the surface, small secrets danced like shadows in the corners. One twitching hand, one protective hold on a locket, one fleeting glance, each told him more than words ever could. The stage was set. Ashford Manor had welcomed its observer, and the quiet game of watching and waiting had begun. The dining room was softly illuminated by the warm glow of a crystal chandelier, casting delicate reflections across polished silverware and pristine white linen. The heavy curtains were drawn against the mist outside, creating a cocoon of light and muted sound. Poirot took his place at the table, his posture impeccable, hands folded lightly in his lap as the guests settled into their assigned seats. The clink of cutlery and the muted hum of polite conversation filled the room, a soothing backdrop to the subtle tension he sensed threading through the assembly. At first, the chatter was mundane, a careful dance of pleasantries. Lady Pembroke spoke of the estate's renovations, while her neighbour recounted a recent theatrical outing in London, each story delivered with measured charm. Yet Poirot's keen eyes caught the flicker of hesitation beneath the surface, a pause too long before answering, a hand brushing nervously against the edge of a glass, a faint tightening of the jaw. Across the table, one gentleman's tale of an afternoon walk in the gardens contradicted the angle of the fading twilight visible through the window behind him. A small discrepancy noted without comment. A servant moved gracefully between the guests, refilling glasses and adjusting napkins. It was then that a soft slip, a napkin falling to the floor, drew Poirot's attention. The paper landed near his polished shoe, partially revealing the edge of folded writing. No one seemed to notice, caught up in polite laughter and the gentle cadence of conversation. With the discreet precision of habit, Poirot bent slightly, lifting the napkin under the pretense of smoothing the carpet, his fingers brushing the faintly inked surface. Only a fragment of a word was visible, a clue half hidden, promising more to be revealed later. The meal continued, the rhythm of courses flowing seamlessly as guests masked subtle rivalries behind smiles and nods. Poirot observed these exchanges with a calm patience, noting the careful selection of topics, the avoidance of certain subjects, and the almost imperceptible tension when two particular guests spoke. A toast was made, glasses raised and tinkling lightly, yet beneath the harmonious ritual, the silent contest of glances and half-smiles revealed unspoken alliances and minor resentments. He imagined the threads of conversation as delicate lines on a tapestry, some fraying, others taut, all contributing to a pattern only perceptive eyes could trace. The aroma of roasted meats and fresh herbs mingled with the faint perfume of Lady Pembroke's gown, creating a sensory layer that seemed almost to distract from the undercurrent of unease. Poirot's attention, however, was never swayed. Every subtle inflection, every brief glance, every twitching finger became a mark in his ledger of observation. The gentleman who had spoken of his walk fidgeted with a cufflink, his eyes momentarily flicking toward the fallen napkin, as though aware of what it might conceal. Poirot noted this silently, the motion adding texture to the narrative of the evening. As dessert was served, a delicate arrangement of custards and fruits, the guests relaxed visibly, yet small tensions remained, lingering like shadows. Poirot, lifting his spoon with careful deliberation, allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile at the quiet choreography before him, a room of genteel manners, polite laughter, and the tiny fissures of concealed truth. Each morsel of conversation, each minor action became part of his mental map. The napkin, folded and tucked discreetly into his pocket, promised a thread to follow, a mystery hiding in plain sight amid the gentle cadence of dinner. The evening was far from over. As the last notes of polite laughter mingled with the soft crackle from the fireplace, Poirot's mind traced the interlaced paths of deceit and curiosity. The discovery of the note, subtle though it was, had shifted the tone imperceptibly, signaling that beneath the harmonious surface, secrets were at play. The guests, unaware of the keen eyes upon them, continued their chatter, unknowingly setting the stage for the first real puzzle that awaited tomorrow. Chapter 2. The First Mystery. A sudden piercing scream cut through the quiet murmur of the manor, reverberating along the polished corridors and into the drawing-room where the guests had gathered. The sound was sharp, urgent, yet strangely brittle, as though it had been restrained by shock. Poirot rose from his chair with the calm precision of a man accustomed to chaos disguised as ordinary life, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he gauged the reactions of those around him. Gentle footsteps echoed across the floorboards as the guests, drawn by instinct and alarm, hurried toward the source, the library. The door stood ajar, swinging softly as if nudged by the wind, though the air within was still and warm. Inside, the scene was immediately unsettling. A once orderly desk had been disturbed, drawers left half open, papers splayed across the surface in apparent carelessness. The safe, normally a stern sentinel of security, yawned empty, its lock gleaming faintly in the lamplight, a silent testament to the missing contents. A silver candelabra teetered slightly at the edge of a shelf, and the scent of fresh varnish mingled oddly with the faint musk of the room, a hint perhaps of recent handling. Guests whispered nervously, their voices trembling between curiosity and fear, sharing fragmented observations in hurried bursts. Poirot's gaze swept the room with unhurried meticulousness. He noted the guests' postures, the tight clenching of hands, the subtle avoidance of certain glances. One gentleman hovered near the mantelpiece, eyes fixed on the floor, as though unwilling to confront the disorder. A lady drew her shawl closer, fingers lightly tapping the fabric in nervous rhythm. Poirot, however, saw beyond these immediate reactions, perceiving patterns in the small gestures, the pauses, the micro-expressions that betrayed more than words could reveal. His attention shifted to the books lining a nearby shelf. One volume, slightly protruding from its companions, disturbed the otherwise flawless alignment. The subtle misplacement suggested hurried handling, a minor oversight in the flurry of activity that must have accompanied the theft. Poirot bent slightly, noting the angle and the faint smudge of dust where a finger had lingered too long. Even in the quiet panic, these details whispered their secrets to the trained observer, hinting at the presence of haste, anxiety, and perhaps a trace of guilt. The guests continued to murmur, speculating in fragmented tones about the missing item, each theory more tentative than the last. Poirot, moving with deliberate calm, allowed himself to ask soft, indirect questions to the nearest observers, his voice a soothing thread that wove through the chaos. He inquired about the time of discovery, the state of the room, the exact positioning of objects, all the while noting reactions, a flicker of hesitation, a sudden glance at another guest, a nervous adjustment of a cuff or a shawl. Each micro-action layered another piece onto the silent puzzle he was assembling. A faint chill crept along the library floorboards as the fire flickered, casting playful shadows across the scattered papers. Poirot's eyes lingered briefly on the safe, imagining the sequence of events that could have led to its breach, comparing it against the gestures of the onlookers. In that quiet observation, he discerned both the human element and the physical evidence, each reinforcing the other in a subtle, unspoken dialogue. The room, once orderly and composed, now hummed with tension and whispered curiosity. Poirot, aware that a hasty conclusion would serve no purpose, allowed the guests to settle while he catalogued every detail. The misaligned books, the scattered papers, the slight tremor in a hand, the furtive glance, all formed an invisible lattice of clues that only he could read fully. With these observations in hand, he began to consider his next steps. Quiet inquiries among the guests, casual conversations designed to reveal truths without fear or accusation, a methodical approach that would gently unravel the evening's central mystery. As the initial shock of the library incident settled into a quiet murmur, Poirot moved among the guests with calm, deliberate grace, his presence unobtrusive yet impossibly attentive. He began his gentle inquiries under the guise of polite conversation, leaning slightly as he addressed each individual, a soft smile and a measured tone inviting openness without pressure. The manor's walls seemed to absorb their voices, the flickering lamplight reflecting in their eyes. revealing tiny flickers of hesitation, the faintest quiver of a lip, a subtle tightening of a hand around a chair. Each gesture spoke volumes to him, far more than their words. He approached Lady Pembroke first, noting the controlled elegance of her posture. "I imagine the shock has unsettled us all," he murmured, voice smooth and comforting, allowing her to respond freely. She nodded, her fingers brushing the silver locket she wore as if it contained a fragment of her courage. Her account of the afternoon's movements seemed consistent at first, yet Poirot's trained gaze caught the brief pause before she mentioned crossing the drawing-room. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but enough to register in the meticulous ledger of his mind. Moving on, he encountered the gentleman who had been restless near the fireplace. His timeline of events contained curious overlaps and omissions, conflicting with statements of others. Poirot, with the softness of a conversational murmur, asked a casual question about the exact hour he had left the study. The guest's hands twitched imperceptibly beneath the table, revealing a subtle discomfort that Poirot noted quietly, a thread in the delicate web of truth and fiction. The table itself provided a minor but telling detail. A watch had been left carelessly near a plate, its face gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Poirot allowed his fingers to brush it gently under the pretense of adjusting the placement of a napkin, noting the hand's alignment with practiced subtlety. The time display did not correspond with the owner's claimed movements. A slight narrowing of his eyes suggested recognition of a small contradiction, an opportunity to probe without accusation. He tucked the observation into his mind, a mental bookmark for a future, more pointed inquiry. Each guest's narrative offered discrepancies, some almost imperceptible, a claimed conversation that could not have occurred, a supposed movement contradicted by the shifting of shadows in the room, a gesture made too slowly to match the recounted timeline. Poirot listened, absorbing the rhythm of their speech, the cadence of their breathing, and the pauses between words. Even the subtle scent of aftershave or perfume carried a faint story, hinting at hurried departures or unanticipated arrivals. Every detail, however small, became part of the larger pattern, a constellation of behavior that only his trained eye could trace. A hush descended as the evening progressed, interrupted by occasional clinks of silverware or low murmurs. Poirot's questions remained gentle, his tone unwavering, yet the cumulative effect was undeniable. Conflicting accounts began to surface more clearly, each small misalignment of time, place, and gesture revealing hidden tensions. The guests, unaware of the detective's inner cataloguing, responded naturally, believing their small evasions would pass unnoticed. By the time Poirot concluded this first round of quiet, conversational interviews, a subtle map of contradictions had emerged. The misaligned watch, the slight tremors of hands, the hesitant glances, all hinted that the evening's events held more complexity than anyone yet realized. He stepped back for a moment, the morning light filtered through tall curtained windows, his mind already tracing soft, muted shadows across the drawing room, where Poirot now conducted his more focused interviews. The air carried a faint scent of polished wood and lingering tea, a quiet backdrop to the subtle tension that had settled over the guests. Each individual, seated or standing in carefully chosen positions, seemed poised between composure and unease, as though sensing that every movement, every word, might be quietly scrutinized. Poirot, with deliberate calm, allowed the room's stillness to amplify the nuances he observed, turning what seemed ordinary into a tapestry rich with hidden meaning. He began with a gentle, almost conversational approach, directing his attention to one of the younger guests, a man whose story had initially seemed straightforward. As he spoke, Poirot noticed the repeated twisting of a handkerchief in nervous fingers, the subtle crease of his brow, the momentary avoidance of direct eye contact. Each micro-action contradicted the gentleman's confident tone, hinting at a tension beneath the surface, a story unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Poirot's questions were indirect, framed as casual inquiries, yet deliberately structured to reveal inconsistencies, the exact timing of movements, the sequence of arrivals, the paths taken through the manor. The young man's replies were careful, measured, but his gestures betrayed the smallest fissures in truth. Lady Pembroke, seated nearby, recounted her afternoon with a calm veneer that masked a faint tremor in her voice. Poirot, leaning slightly forward, asked a mild question about a visitor she claimed to have seen on the terrace. Her gaze flickered momentarily to the fireplace, and a subtle tightening of her lips suggested discomfort with the detail she had just supplied. Poirot filed the observation silently, noting that even the smallest deviation in posture, the briefest hesitation, could signal layers of hidden motives. Other guests provided their own fragments, each story overlapping or contradicting another in minor yet telling ways. Poirot's eyes moved from hand to face, from posture to fleeting expressions, cataloguing the tiniest details, a foot tapping beneath the chair, a finger brushing against the rim of a glass, a sudden shift in breathing. These minor cues, unnoticed by most, formed a lattice of behavioral evidence that Poirot traced with quiet precision. A faint rustle of a gown, a soft clearing of the throat, each became a note in the symphony of observation. He allowed his inquiries to flow like gentle currents, careful not to alarm or provoke. His questions were soft, yet pointed, inviting answers that could be verified against known timelines and the physical traces of the manor. Occasionally he would pause, tilting his head slightly, as though listening to some imperceptible rhythm that only he could detect. In these moments, even a small twitch of an eye or the briefest contraction of a jaw could speak volumes. Poirot's attention returned repeatedly to the young gentleman with the handkerchief. He asked an offhand question about an afternoon walk through the gardens, watching for the slightest reaction. The handkerchief tightened once, twice, and his gaze dropped momentarily to the floor, tiny betrayals of nervousness. Poirot noted each micro-expression with the patience of a man accustomed to seeing truth slip beneath layers of politeness and deception. By the end of the morning's round of interviews, the subtle lies, overlaps, and hesitations had formed a pattern. While each guest maintained the appearance of propriety, the inconsistencies were undeniable to Poirot's trained eye. The falsified alibis, the small gestures of anxiety, and the contradictions in timelines had created a web of intrigue that beckoned him toward further investigation. With a calm exhale, he rose and prepared to examine the study privately. The next stage of discovery awaiting just beyond the threshold, where the physical traces of the evening's disruptions would meet the subtle truths revealed by observation. The study greeted Poirot in muted quiet, the late morning light spilling across polished wood and neatly stacked books. Yet the disorder left by the previous evening's intrusion was undeniable. Drawers hung slightly ajar, papers fanned across the desktop in gentle disarray, and the faint smell of disturbed dust hung in the air, mingling with the lingering scent of candle wax. Poirot stepped inside slowly, his eyes sweeping the room with the deliberate precision of a man attuned to the whispers of detail. Every corner, every surface offered a story for the patient observer. His gaze settled first on the carpet, noting impressions left in the soft fibers, footprints of varying sizes, the slight indentation of a heel too deep, the curve of a shoe edge pressed into the rug. Each print suggested weight, hesitation, or urgency, and Poirot catalogued these silently, comparing them against the guest's likely movements. A gentle shift of the curtains allowed a slant of sunlight to illuminate the polished legs of the desk, revealing subtle smudges where hands had brushed lightly against varnish. Evidence, perhaps of hurried search or misplaced care. Poirot moved methodically through the room, bending occasionally to examine the alignment of books on the shelves. One volume leaned slightly forward, disrupting the otherwise perfect line, and he noted the trace of dust disturbed along its spine. Such a minor detail might escape any casual observer, yet it hinted at both haste and familiarity with the environment, a whisper of someone who had handled the books with purpose. His fingers lingered briefly, tracing the edges of polished wood, feeling the subtle warmth left by recent touch. His attention returned to the silver locket he had observed at dinner, now resting lightly on a side table. With practiced care, Poirot produced a small magnifying glass, holding it delicately to the locket's surface. The faint glint of metal caught the light as he rotated it, revealing an impression so subtle it might have been mistaken for a scratch. There, partially etched into the smooth interior, was the contour of a ring, its shape faint but discernible, a fragmentary signature of the hand that had touched it. Poirot's lips curved in a slight, knowing smile. This tiny mark promised a connection between the physical evidence and the behavioral clues he had been noting. He lingered over this observation, letting the room's quiet absorb him, turning the finding over in his mind. The fingerprint, incomplete though it was, suggested someone familiar enough to handle the locket without immediate detection, yet anxious enough to leave an inadvertent mark. The faint trace aligned with other observations, the restless gestures, the furtive glances, the micro-expressions noted during the morning interviews. In the stillness, Poirot could almost trace the hand's path across the room, imagining the brief tension of a grasp, the pause before release. Even as he examined the physical traces, Poirot maintained an awareness of the room's atmosphere, the muted creak of floorboards under his careful steps, the faint shift of sunlight along the carpet, the soft flutter of a curtain in a gentle breeze, all contributed to the immersive tableau in which clues could quietly reveal themselves, each detail built upon the last, layering observation upon observation, allowing him to construct a mental map of movement, intent, and subtle anxiety. Satisfied with his initial survey, Poirot straightened, replacing the magnifying glass and folding his hands lightly in front of him. The room had yielded its secrets in whispers rather than shouts, and he felt the gentle thrill of discovery without alarm. The locket's fingerprint promised a tangible lead, one that would guide his next inquiries. With the clues quietly assembled in his mind, he prepared to leave the study, intent on speaking with the household staff. Their perspectives, he knew, would illuminate the human element behind the traces, further unraveling the web of actions and alibis that now encircled the manor. Chapter 4. Suspicions. The afternoon sun slanted gently through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's tea-room, casting a warm glow over polished wood and delicate porcelain cups. Steam rose from freshly poured tea, curling in lazy spirals, carrying the comforting scent of bergamot and freshly baked scones. Poirot, seated at the edge of a small chaise, observed the assembly of guests with his usual quiet intensity, allowing the rhythm of polite conversation to wash over him while his mind catalogued each subtle gesture. Every tilt of a head, every soft laugh, every fleeting glance carried meaning, if one knew how to read it. Lady Pembroke chatted lightly with a neighbour about the estate's flower beds, but her eyes kept flicking toward another guest across the table. Their conversation, though outwardly calm, carried an undercurrent of tension. A faint arch of an eyebrow, a brief pause before answering, suggested rivalry beneath the veneer of civility. Nearby, the younger gentleman who had twisted his handkerchief so often at dinner appeared more relaxed, but still carried a restless energy in the subtle tapping of a finger on the tabletop. Poirot's gaze lingered on him, noting the way his eyes followed movements across the room, as though tracking hidden patterns invisible to the others. The maid moved between the tables, setting plates with quiet precision, and as she reached to pour tea for the younger gentleman, a slight mishap caused a cup to tip, the amber liquid spilling softly onto the white tablecloth. A collective murmur rippled through the room, polite apologies exchanged with delicate formality. Poirot's keen eyes, however, caught a small envelope tucked beneath the edge of the spilled cup, partially obscured by the napkin. With a fluid motion that drew no attention, he lifted the envelope and glimpsed the corner of handwritten script inside. The fragment was enough to reveal a contradiction, an assertion made by one of the guests in earlier conversation did not align with what was written here. The subtle incident did not disrupt the room's calm, but added a quiet spark of curiosity. Poirot traced the movements of those nearby, noting who seemed startled by the spill, who allowed their gaze to linger a fraction longer than decorum demanded, and who instinctively averted their eyes. Each micro-action, seemingly trivial, enriched his mental map of alliances and hidden tensions, weaving a network of relationships that might otherwise have passed unnoticed. The envelope's fragment, now discreetly secured in his pocket, promised a tangible lead that could corroborate or challenge these impressions. As conversation continued, Poirot noted the interplay of whispered comments and subtle body language. A shared smile between two guests seemed warm yet loaded with intention, suggesting an unspoken alliance. Another guest's faint frown, softened immediately into a polite nod, hinted at internal disagreement or quiet disapproval. Poirot catalogued these signals alongside his observations of physical traces, the careful placement of hands, the slight adjustment of chairs, the way teaspoons were lightly tapped against china rims. Each movement was a brushstroke in the portrait of hidden motives and intricate social webs. The sun shifted, casting longer shadows across the room, lending an almost cinematic rhythm to the quiet activity. Poirot allowed the gentle flow of social interaction to continue, all the while mentally tracing connections, testing theories against each nuance he observed. The envelope, small and seemingly insignificant, had revealed a crack in a carefully maintained story, and he felt the thrill of a quiet discovery, the kind that unfolded without alarm yet promised insight into deeper mysteries. As the tea service drew to a close, Poirot's mind was already weaving together the day's discoveries, the social tension, the subtle glances, the whispered comments, and now the contradictory fragment of writing created a lattice of intrigue that demanded careful exploration. The afternoon had provided more than comfort. It had delivered hidden clues, unspoken rivalries, and delicate threads of truth that would guide him toward the revelations awaiting in the next stage of his investigation. The late afternoon sun cast a honeyed glow through the drawing-room windows as Poirot asked a few of the key guests to join him in quiet discussion. The others, engaged in gentle reading or soft conversation, left the space undisturbed, leaving the room with a sense of intimacy and hushed focus. Poirot's voice was calm and measured as he invited them to recount their movements once more, framing questions with the courtesy of a host and the precision of a seasoned detective. Every word, every pause seemed carefully designed to elicit subtle truths without provocation. The first guest spoke smoothly, tracing a timeline of their activities with apparent ease. Yet Poirot's eyes, sharp and patient, followed a small, almost imperceptible tremor in the speaker's hands. The other guest nodded in agreement, yet a slight furrow of the brow betrayed an internal dissonance, a discrepancy between what was being said and what was silently remembered. Poirot allowed the conversation to flow naturally, asking indirect questions about casual interactions, hallway passages, and the times they had seen each other. Each response, seemingly benign, added threads to a growing tapestry of observation. A quiet clink of a teaspoon against china punctuated the soft hum of the room. Poirot's gaze settled on a subtle detail, a faint stain on the cuff of one guest's sleeve, barely noticeable in the gentle light. Its position suggested recent contact with something moist or freshly handled, contradicting the timeline of the alibi they had just provided. Poirot allowed a momentary pause, letting the observation sink in for himself without drawing attention, a micro-revelation that would later become pivotal in understanding the true sequence of events. The dialogue moved from generalities to more precise accounts, and with each retelling, minor inconsistencies began to emerge. One guest claimed to have been in the drawing room while another insisted the same space had been empty at that time. Poirot's gentle prompting encouraged them to clarify, and each subtle hesitation, each shift in posture, became a clue in the quiet puzzle unfolding before him. The contrast between the composed exterior and the faint telltales of anxiety revealed layers of concealed information, a delicate interplay of truth and evasion. As the conversation deepened, Poirot's mind traced the sequences with the care of a musician following a complex score. The overlapping alibis, the faint stain on a sleeve, the micro-gestures of tension, and the flickers of uncertainty in expression created a subtle web of intrigue. It was not loud or alarming. It was the kind of mystery that unfolded in whispers, in half-recalled timings, in the soft contradictions that could escape all but the most attentive observer. For the audience, this was a moment to lean in, to notice the small but telling details alongside the detective, feeling the quiet satisfaction of recognizing patterns and possibilities. A faint breeze stirred the curtains, brushing lightly against the polished floorboards, adding a sensory rhythm to the measured conversation. Poirot, without urgency, reviewed the impressions forming in his mind. The conflicting timelines, the barely perceptible stain, the tiny hesitations, all hinted at movements that had not yet been accounted for. There was no rush, only the careful building of understanding, as he prepared to trace these subtle contradictions further. As the discussion drew to a close, Poirot allowed a final soft question to hang in the air, observing the guests' reactions with quiet intensity. The contradictions and overlapping alibis left a delicate tension in the room, a gentle anticipation of the deeper exploration to come. With the emerging inconsistencies catalogued, Poirot rose, ready to shift his attention toward the patterns of household routines and servant movements, the next crucial layer of inquiry that would carry the investigation forward into the evening and beyond. Chapter 5. Hidden Motives. The late afternoon sun softened as it filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's study, casting long, golden streaks across the polished floor and the scattered papers Poirot had been quietly examining. The room smelled faintly of ink and old parchment, a comforting blend that seemed to whisper of hidden stories and carefully preserved secrets. Poirot moved with measured calm, his gloved fingers lightly tracing the edges of envelopes, folded letters, and neatly stacked correspondence, each item a small fragment of human emotion, carefully concealed yet rich with subtle hints. He lifted a folded letter, worn at the edges and torn slightly along the corner, and unfolded it with deliberate care. The handwriting was elegant yet hurried, the words revealing restrained frustration and unspoken jealousy. A reference to a meeting scheduled precisely on the day of the theft caught his attention, the date inscribed faintly in the margin, almost overlooked by anyone else. Poirot's eyes narrowed subtly. Here lay a temporal anchor, a connection between personal intrigue and the events that had disturbed the manor. Every flourish, every punctuation mark seemed loaded with meaning, a testament to the writer's emotional state and their hidden concerns. Nearby, a series of personal notes hinted at inheritance disputes and financial concerns, delicately veiled behind polite language. One guest appeared frequently in the correspondence, their name repeated in contexts suggesting frustration, envy, or ambition. Poirot catalogued each reference with the quiet diligence of a man who understood that human desire, more than any physical clue, often guided action. A small slip of paper tucked into a book revealed a fragment of romantic entanglement, a soft yet potent hint at secret connections between two guests whose outward politeness masked private affairs. As he examined the letters, Poirot allowed himself to observe the nuances of the handwriting, the pressure of the pen, the slant of the words, the occasional smudge where emotion had briefly overtaken composure. Even a seemingly trivial choice of phrase suggested the emotional landscape behind the writing: disappointment, jealousy, hope, or restrained anger. Each fragment painted a small section of the larger mosaic of human motive, and Poirot, as always, read it with both care and curiosity, understanding that these invisible threads often led directly to tangible consequences. A torn corner of a note revealed a fleeting reference to the theft itself, faint and almost accidental, like a whisper, meant only for the attentive. Poirot traced the date carefully, mentally aligning it with the timeline he had meticulously constructed from guest observations and physical evidence. The subtle connection sent a gentle thrill through his analytical mind, not a rush of alarm, but a quiet satisfaction at uncovering another layer of the narrative hidden beneath social facades and polite conversation. The manor, bathed in soft afternoon light, seemed to exhale quietly around him, the warmth of hearth and polished wood lending a sense of intimacy to the discovery. Poirot's gloved hand paused over a final envelope, containing a carefully written note that implied both resentment and secret negotiation, the kind of correspondence that, in the hands of the wrong person, could easily catalyze mischief. Each piece of paper, each folded corner, was a window into the delicate intricacies of desire, ambition, and concealed emotion, forming the emotional groundwork for the tensions he had observed during tea and private questioning. As he carefully replaced the letters and notes, Poirot allowed himself a moment to synthesize the revelations. The jealousy, inheritance anxieties, and romantic entanglements were not merely background color. They were active currents shaping the interactions of the guests and, quite possibly, guiding their movements during the theft. With this knowledge in hand, he felt ready to move toward confrontation, to gently probe the layers of human complexity and uncover the truth behind the subtle, interwoven motives that had disrupted the otherwise tranquil life of Ashford Manor. The afternoon air was crisp and gentle, as Poirot led the group along the winding paths of Ashford Manor's expansive grounds. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the faint fragrance of fallen leaves and late-blooming flowers. Sunlight dappled the gravel paths, creating pools of warmth that contrasted with the slight chill in shaded corners. Guests walked in pairs or small clusters, their conversations polite but lightly charged, laughter mingling with murmured comments, as if the beauty of the grounds allowed them a temporary release from tension. Poirot's steps were measured, his gaze constantly scanning, noting the subtleties that would escape anyone less attuned. He observed Lady Pembroke adjusting her gloves as she followed a winding path, her eyes flicking toward a narrow, overgrown trail that led behind the hedge maze. A brief, almost imperceptible hesitation in her step suggested curiosity, perhaps even caution, and Poirot stored the observation with quiet precision. Nearby, the young gentleman with the handkerchief kept glancing toward the same hidden path, fingers brushing at his coat pocket, as though aware of something waiting out of sight. These micro-moments, fleeting and almost casual, formed a network of subtle behaviors that spoke louder than conversation ever could. The group paused briefly by a low stone wall, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot punctuating the gentle hum of polite chatter. Poirot allowed the guests to linger while his eyes traced the ground ahead, noting small disturbances in the otherwise pristine paths. A series of shallow impressions, the delicate indentations of shoes pressed into mud, led discreetly toward a secluded garden shed tucked behind a cluster of overgrown shrubs. The footprints were light but deliberate, a quiet signature of movement unnoticed by the casual observer. Poirot inclined his head ever so slightly, the tiniest acknowledgement of the hidden trail that suggested both secrecy and purpose. As conversation resumed, Poirot's attention shifted to the interplay between the guests. A whispered exchange across the path, accompanied by a fleeting hand gesture toward the hedge, hinted at shared knowledge or perhaps unspoken strategy. Laughter punctuated the moment, masking subtle intrigue. Poirot's eyes caught the smallest clues, the way a glove finger twitched, the tilt of a head toward a hidden corner, the gentle tap of a walking stick against a stone. Each movement was a brushstroke in the larger tableau of human behavior, revealing patterns of interest, avoidance, and latent intent. The sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows that mingled with the foliage, creating pockets of semi-darkness along the gravel. Poirot followed the trail of impressions to the shed, noting the faint scrape of wood against stone where the door had recently been moved. The air around the shed held the faint scent of damp earth and aged timber, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm recent passage. Even in this quiet, almost serene setting, the evidence whispered possibilities, each subtle cue a thread for Poirot to unravel later. As the walk continued, the guests' attention drifted toward the flowering borders and distant ponds, unaware of the small discoveries recorded in the detective's mind. Poirot, maintaining a gentle presence among them, allowed the natural rhythm of the stroll to camouflage his scrutiny. The muddy footprints and the concealed shed became mental bookmarks, evidence quietly interwoven with the ongoing social tableau. These small observations would later provide the essential context to challenge alibis, uncover hidden behavior, and illuminate motives that had until now remained shadowed by civility and charm. By the time the group returned toward the manor, the gentle tension of curiosity had been subtly heightened, layered within the beauty of the grounds and the calm cadence of conversation. Poirot's observations of gestures, pathways, and footprints had quietly advanced the investigation, laying the groundwork for the unraveling of alibis that awaited in the next chapter. The serene stroll had concealed a tapestry of hidden behavior, ready to be drawn into the light of discovery. Chapter 6. The Impossible Alibi. The drawing-room of Ashford Manor was bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon light, the high windows filtering golden rays over the polished wood and carefully arranged furnishings. Guests gathered in quiet clusters, each settling into chairs or standing by the fireplace, their voices hushed, the atmosphere a blend of polite civility and an undercurrent of unease. Poirot moved among them with his characteristic calm, hands folded lightly behind his back, eyes bright with gentle attention. His presence alone seemed to focus the room, drawing the gaze of each guest without force or alarm. He invited everyone to sit, his voice smooth and measured as he began to recount observations from earlier in the day. "We have seen many subtleties, have we not?" he began, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Movements, gestures, and even the smallest of objects can tell a story far larger than words alone. He allowed a brief pause, letting the idea settle into the minds of his audience. The soft ticking of a nearby clock punctuated the room, emphasizing the gentle cadence of his delivery and the quiet gravity of the discussion. Poirot's eyes traveled across the room, noting reactions with the precision of a man attuned to the subtlest cues. When he casually mentioned the silver locket resting lightly in his hand, he observed a flicker of tension in one guest's posture, a subtle stiffening of the shoulders, the faint quickening of a breath. A smile, polite yet strained, barely masked the momentary lapse in composure. Across the room, the younger gentleman's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair, a rhythmic gesture betraying an inner calculation. These minor signs, seemingly inconsequential to anyone else, spoke volumes to Poirot. He continued, speaking of the time discrepancies revealed by the watch left on the tea table, mentioning the alignment of its hands with his usual calm, almost casual precision. The room, outwardly serene, responded with subtle micro-expressions, a lifted eyebrow, a tightening of a fist against the armrest, the faint brush of a hand against the fabric of a sleeve. Each reaction, small yet vivid, formed a delicate tapestry of human truth and concealed knowledge. Poirot did not rush, allowing his observations and words to intertwine, creating a space where tension built naturally through curiosity rather than alarm. As he wove the discussion, he invited soft recollections from each guest, prompting them to reflect on minor movements, passing interactions, and fleeting moments that might otherwise have been dismissed. Polite corrections and gentle hesitations surfaced in response to his questions, highlighting the subtle inconsistencies that had accumulated over the course of the day. A soft rustle of silk, the quiet shuffle of a chair, and the gentle clearing of a throat accompanied these revelations, grounding the observations in the tangible, cozy atmosphere of the room. One guest, seated near the fireplace, reacted with barely perceptible nervousness when Poirot referenced the alignment of their account with the timing of the watch and the locket. Their eyes flicked momentarily toward the mantel, and a shallow inhalation betrayed a brief spike of tension, quickly masked by a polite smile. Poirot noted the micro-expression, committing it to memory as another piece of the subtle puzzle that would soon form a coherent picture. By the end of the discussion, the atmosphere had shifted imperceptibly. The room remained calm, the guests composed, yet the gentle tension of curiosity and observation lingered in the air. Each micro-reaction, every small gesture, had layered additional intrigue into the narrative, heightening audience engagement without alarm. Poirot's quiet presentation of the minor inconsistencies and his careful observation of their responses had set the stage for the more analytical unraveling of alibis that would follow. The next section, promising the first glimpse of resolution within the intricate web of secrets at Ashford Manor. The drawing-room, now settled into the softer light of early evening, felt simultaneously intimate and charged with quiet anticipation. Poirot stood near the hearth, fingers lightly clasped behind him, his eyes sweeping the assembled guests with a serene intensity. Each had been seated or arranged with subtle care, creating a tableau that mirrored the calm order he sought to restore in the wake of confusion. The detective spoke in a measured tone, soft yet precise, inviting attention without urgency. "Let us consider together the series of events that unfolded within these walls," he began, his voice carrying the warmth of conversation, but the weight of observation. He gestured gently toward the locket, now held lightly in his gloved hand, and recalled the faint fingerprint discovered during his careful study. The room remained still, each guest absorbing the subtle significance. Poirot described the sequence of gestures and minor movements that might otherwise have been dismissed. The alignment of books slightly disturbed on the shelf, a finger tracing the edge of polished wood, a step barely audible upon the soft carpet. Each action, seemingly trivial, contributed to the mosaic of truth he was patiently assembling. As he recounted the movements, he spoke of the watch left on the tea table, the discrepancy between its hands and the claim timeline. Poirot's tone remained gentle, almost conversational, yet each word carefully guided the audience to consider the implications. The narrative unfolded like a quiet film, every motion and gesture interwoven with the others, revealing patterns invisible to casual observation. Guests shifted subtly in their seats, some glancing toward one another, their polite composure tempered by the awareness that their minor deceptions had not escaped notice. Poirot traced the overlapping alibis, highlighting the small gaps and overlaps without accusation. He described how a guest's brief hesitation, the twist of a handkerchief, and a glance toward the hedge during the earlier walk all aligned with the physical evidence, the muddy footprints leading to the garden shed, the faint scrape of wood, the subtle disturbance of dust along the study shelves. Each element was a piece of the puzzle, and as he carefully connected them, the illusion of impossibility gradually dissolved. The alibi, once thought unassailable, revealed its artful construction. A hushed murmur passed through the room as Poirot gently indicated the convergence of evidence, the fingerprint on the locket, the alignment of fallen books, the tiny stain on a cuff, and the inconsistencies in timing. He allowed a moment of silence, letting the connections emerge naturally in the minds of the guests and, for the audience, allowing the satisfaction of piecing together the narrative alongside him. The revelation was not dramatic or loud, but precise, intellectually rewarding, and deeply gratifying in its clarity. Poirot's voice remained calm and measured as he summarized the reconstruction. Each small observation, the micro-gestures, the fleeting expressions, the physical traces, was now woven into a coherent timeline. The impossible alibi, carefully fabricated to mislead, stood exposed in its simplicity. The apparent contradictions, the tiny oversights, and the subtle signs of nervousness converged to tell a clear story. The revelation was both elegant and humane, delivered with the gentle respect that Poirot extended to all, emphasizing understanding as much as resolution. As he concluded, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension easing into quiet reflection. The audience, having followed each thread of observation and deduction, experienced the satisfying aha moment, feeling both mentally engaged and emotionally settled. Chapter 7. Confessions. The late evening light had softened into a gentle amber, filtering through the tall windows of Poirot's private sitting room. The room smelled faintly of polished wood, and the lingering aroma of freshly brewed tea, a comforting atmosphere that contrasted with the gravity of the conversation about to unfold. The culprit, a young guest, whose composure had wavered throughout the day, sat across from Poirot, hands folded tightly in their lap. There was an air of hesitancy, a delicate tension that spoke of internal conflict, as if every word to come had been rehearsed, yet remained frightening in its vulnerability. Poirot, seated calmly opposite, allowed the silence to stretch momentarily, giving space for thought, reflection, and the courage to speak. His voice, gentle and measured, invited confession without judgment. "Mon ami," he said softly, "it is only through truth that we may find peace." The words hung lightly in the room, like a soft encouragement, allowing the young guest to exhale and release the weight they had carried. Their eyes, glistening faintly, met Poirot's steady gaze, signaling the fragile trust being extended. A quiet sigh broke the stillness, and the confession began in a trembling voice, recounting the events leading to the theft. The narrative was hesitant, punctuated by pauses, each one weighted with both regret and relief. Poirot listened attentively, nodding occasionally, his subtle gestures offering silent reassurance. Every tremor of the hands, every quiver in the voice, revealed layers of human emotion that words alone could not convey. A single tear slipped down the guest's cheek, and Poirot, with the utmost delicacy, noted the sincerity behind the gesture, a signal that the confession was not performed for observation, but born of genuine remorse. As the narrative unfolded, the undercurrent of emotional complexity became clear. Motivations intertwined with personal vulnerabilities, envy restrained by social decorum, ambition tempered by conscience, and fear of disappointing those whose esteem mattered most. Poirot, ever the observer of subtle human truth, catalogued each micro-expression, the tightening of shoulders, the brief glance toward the floor, the soft swallow that preceded certain admissions. These were the details that lent authenticity to the confession, allowing him to see not only the actions, but the person behind them. Once the account was complete, Poirot spoke softly, his words carefully chosen to affirm understanding without condemnation. "We all carry imperfections," he observed, "and it is in acknowledging them that we find clarity and the possibility of reconciliation." The warmth in his tone, combined with the calm presence he maintained, created a safe, emotional space. Even as the confession laid bare wrongdoing, the atmosphere did not feel threatening. It felt human, intimate, and restorative. Outside the private room, the other guests remained largely unaware of the specifics, yet the subtle energy of the household had shifted. A faint ripple of relief passed through those who had been tense, their expressions softening, their interactions carrying hints of empathy and understanding. Even from a distance, one could sense that the rigid tension of the day was easing, replaced by quiet compassion, a gentle acknowledgement of fallibility and forgiveness. Poirot allowed the moment to linger, recognizing the importance of emotional closure as much as the factual resolution of the crime. The tearful gesture, the hesitant voice, and the visible relief all formed a delicate tableau of honesty and redemption. The drawing-room of Ashford Manor was suffused with the soft glow of evening light, the last amber rays spilling through tall windows and illuminating the polished surfaces with a gentle warmth. The guests gathered once more, this time with a noticeable ease in posture, their faces softened by relief and the subtle satisfaction of clarity. Poirot, standing near the hearth with the recovered silver locket resting lightly in his hand, surveyed the room with a serene, quiet authority. Every guest felt the atmosphere shift, the gentle relaxation that follows the resolution of tension, the quiet comfort of understanding restored. He placed the locket carefully back into its secure case on the side table, a gesture both symbolic and practical. It was a quiet moment, yet it carried profound significance, the resolution of the mystery, the end of deception, and the restoration of order within the household. Poirot's voice, calm and measured, invited reflection. "Mon ami," he began, "today has revealed more than the movements of hands or the alignment of objects. It has revealed the subtle workings of human nature, our errors, our fears, and the ways in which we seek to protect what we hold dear." His tone was gentle, imbued with warmth, allowing the message to resonate without pressure or moralizing. Guests responded with soft smiles, nods, and quiet murmurs of agreement. One of the younger ladies, previously anxious and restless, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture signaling relief. Another guest, who had been overly guarded during earlier interactions, relaxed his shoulders and exchanged a light-hearted glance with a neighbour, as if acknowledging the absurdity of their earlier tensions. Poirot observed each small movement with subtle delight, noting the restoration of decorum and the return of warmth to social interactions that had been overshadowed by suspicion. He guided the conversation gently toward reflection, asking questions that encouraged the guests to consider the lessons embedded in the day's events. They spoke quietly of vigilance, honesty, and the importance of attentiveness to both people and circumstance. The discussion remained soft and cozy, more like a shared musing than a lecture, and each participant felt invited into the thoughtful rhythm of insight without fear of judgment. Subtle humour crept into the exchanges, a gentle tease here, a knowing glance there, reinforcing camaraderie and human connection. Even small domestic details carried symbolic weight. Chairs were straightened with renewed care, cups aligned neatly on trays, and minor adjustments to daily routines, once sources of tension, were now performed with a new-found ease. Poirot noted the practical gestures alongside the emotional, understanding that comfort often emerges as much from order as from insight. Each micro-action of tidying, aligning, or simply exchanging a friendly word contributed to the overall sense of restored balance within Ashford Manor. As twilight deepened and shadows lengthened across the floor, the room settled into a quiet harmony. Poirot allowed a final moment of reflection, eyes scanning the group with satisfaction. The locket secured, the lessons shared, and the relationships gently mended, the manor felt as though it had exhaled collectively. Even the smallest gestures, the soft brushing of dust from a tabletop, the careful folding of a napkin, the exchanged nods of reassurance, echoed the restored calm. With the conclusion of the evening, Poirot sensed that the threads of curiosity, tension, and human complexity had been resolved to their proper place. The guests, now at ease, moved through the room with quiet smiles and gentle laughter, embracing the subtle humour and warmth of shared understanding. The stage was set for reflection and closure, the perfect transition into the epilogue, where the serene aftermath of the mystery could be quietly savoured, leaving listeners relaxed, content, and gently immersed in the calm world of Ashford Manor. Chapter 8. Reflections and Departure. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of Ashford Manor, casting a pale golden glow across the polished floors and the carefully arranged furnishings. A quiet calm had settled over the estate, the kind that follows resolution and the gentle restoration of order. Poirot moved among his belongings with deliberate care, folding his coat and placing his case near the door, each movement precise yet unhurried. The atmosphere was serene, almost reflective, carrying the soft hum of birds outside and the faint rustle of leaves in the gardens beyond. Guests moved through the corridors, exchanging polite farewells and subtle gestures of gratitude. A young lady adjusted her scarf before offering a warm smile, while a gentleman straightened his gloves, nodding in quiet acknowledgement. Conversations were soft, measured, and tinged with nostalgia, each word carrying a subtle reflection of the day's events. The lessons learned, the importance of honesty, the acknowledgement of hidden desires, the gentle recognition of human imperfection, hung in the air like a delicate perfume, sensed but not overbearing. Poirot observed with his characteristic calm, noting the minor gestures that revealed both relief and quiet amusement. Pausing by a window overlooking the garden, Poirot's gaze settled on a small cluster of late-blooming flowers, their petals damp with morning dew. The subtle beauty of the scene, so easily overlooked, prompted a moment of reflection. He thought of the human nature he had observed, the interplay of desire and restraint, fear and courage, secrecy and confession. The small, hidden corners of the estate, just like the quiet recesses of the heart, held stories waiting to be gently understood. He allowed himself a brief smile, appreciating both the complexity and the simplicity of it all. As he resumed packing, a servant approached with a folded note, delivered with quiet discretion. Poirot accepted it, glancing briefly at the handwriting. It was a small gesture of thanks from a guest, a simple acknowledgement of his guidance, of the way he had untangled not only the physical mystery, but the emotional intricacies of the household. He carefully placed the note atop his belongings, a tangible reminder of connection and human warmth. Each minor interaction, each shared glance, reinforced the sense of closure and reassurance that had been woven throughout the past days. The guests continued their preparations for departure, soft footsteps echoing in the corridor, laughter lightly threading through whispered exchanges. Even the house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of contentment, its polished wood and familiar furnishings bathed in the gentle sunlight. Poirot moved toward the door, pausing to check once more that all was in order, that no loose ends, physical or emotional, remained unattended. The subtle care in these actions mirrored the broader lessons of attention, empathy, and careful observation he had imparted through both presence and example. Before stepping outside, Poirot lingered for a final moment at the garden gate. The morning breeze stirred leaves across the path, and he allowed his gaze to wander over the hedges, the flower beds, and the winding gravel paths. Each detail reminded him that mysteries were as much about human nature as they were about objects and timing, that the smallest signs often carried the richest truths. He inhaled the crisp air, the scent of earth and flowers mingling in a quiet symphony, feeling a gentle satisfaction in the harmony restored to both people and place. With a final, measured glance, Poirot lifted his case and began toward the waiting carriage. The soft crunch of wheels on gravel and the muted murmur of guests bidding farewell created a gentle soundtrack to the moment. The estate, peaceful and restored, seemed to glow with quiet reflection, a perfect backdrop for the detective's departure. Listeners, immersed in the calm rhythm of these final moments, experienced the soothing culmination of curiosity, tension, and human warmth, a gentle, satisfying close to the story's journey. The morning train station was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of early sunlight that shimmered on the tracks and cast gentle reflections across the polished wood of the waiting benches. A few porters moved calmly among the luggage, the occasional murmur of travellers blending with the rhythmic click of distant wheels on rails. Poirot, impeccably composed, adjusted his coat and carried his small case with measured precision, each movement deliberate and unobtrusive. The crisp morning air carried a faint scent of coal and earth, mingling with the subtle fragrance of dew-dampened flower beds just beyond the station gates. He paused momentarily to observe the small details of the platform: a mother smoothing her child's hair, a man carefully arranging his papers, a stray feather drifting across the tracks. Each seemingly minor observation held significance to Poirot's mind, as though every fleeting gesture or overlooked object contributed to the larger understanding of human behavior. He smiled faintly, noting how curiosity and attentiveness could reveal so much about a person's character without uttering a word. As he approached the train, he discreetly folded a small note into the inner pocket of his coat, a subtle gesture that reminded him and the audience that the pursuit of observation and understanding never truly ends. Even as the mystery of Ashford Manor concluded, the detective's attention remained attuned to the small, often overlooked details of life, a quiet affirmation that curiosity was both a tool and a comfort. Inside the carriage, Poirot settled into a plush seat, his posture straight yet relaxed. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the tracks created a gentle cadence, a soothing backdrop for reflection. He allowed his eyes to wander across the passing countryside, noting the play of light on distant hedgerows, the shimmer of dew on flowering meadows, and the occasional movement of wildlife hidden among the trees. Each observation, while seemingly ordinary, carried layers of meaning, gestures, patterns, and interactions that quietly mirrored the mysteries he had untangled at Ashford Manor. In the stillness of the carriage, Poirot's mind replayed the events of the past days with gentle precision. The slight tremor of a hand, the fleeting glance toward a hidden path, the misalignment of a book, the faint fingerprint on the locket, all had formed a tapestry of human intention, revealing both error and insight, concealment and truth. The quiet satisfaction of understanding, the subtle alignment of facts with human behavior, brought a sense of calm completion, a cerebral delight that was deeply comforting yet intellectually stimulating. The landscape blurred softly past the window as the train gathered speed, and Poirot allowed a small, private smile. Each guest's subtle personal growth, the restoration of harmony in the manor, and the resolution of the seemingly impossible alibi were all quietly satisfying, not in dramatic spectacle, but in the measured unfolding of observation and understanding. Even in parting, the gentle lessons of empathy, patience, and attentiveness lingered, leaving the narrative imbued with warmth and reassurance. As the train carried him further from Ashford Manor, the soft hum of movement and the occasional whisper of passing wind outside created a final, reflective rhythm. Poirot leaned back slightly, the folded note a discreet reminder of unending curiosity, and allowed himself to appreciate the calm, deliberate beauty of ordinary moments, the quiet order restored to both place and people. For listeners, the serene cadence of the journey, the reflective observations and the gentle closure provided a perfect ending, a cozy, intellectually satisfying conclusion that lingered softly in the imagination, leaving both mind and heart gently at ease.